it's okay. We figured it out.
All right, if y'all can get settled, please.
Mr. Hearing Officer, when we get settled, I have a motion or request before we start.
All right. I think everybody's here, so you can go ahead, Mr. Rose.
Okay, thank you. Just want to state for the record that we, our clients, and we object to moving forward with this proceeding, given the pending litigation between the board and the city. It's our understanding that, and quite frankly, I think the board should disclose the fact that it brought an action yesterday or this morning, I guess it was yesterday, against the city concerning this proceeding and its authority to move forward. I won't opine on what I think the propriety of the action is, but until the court decides whether this board should move forward, I think it's proper not to move forward and to wait for that direction. Secondly, and I note that at least there wasn't anything I was aware of or that any of the other attorneys were aware of as to whether the board took a formal action to bring the complaint. And if so, whether that action met the requirements of the Open Meetings Act before this board can act. It's my understanding that even for litigation and pending threatened litigation, that the Open Meetings Act applies, and that the board's open meeting guideline, open meeting resolution requires, even for a special meeting, 72-hour notice. While they can discuss it in closed session, they'd have to have a session go into closed session before they could act. And as far as I know, no notice was given and no action was taken. So I think it's our perception that the action being brought may be ultra virus under the board's authority, or at least contrary to the Open Meetings Act. And in light of that, the boards put themselves in an advocacy position relative to this proceeding. And as far as we can tell, can no longer be perform their task as deciding these issues based on the record before them. So we would request that you stay the proceeding until we get further direction. Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer.
And just to clarify, that was an objection?
Both an objection and a motion, I guess. Object to moving forward and then move that the board stay these proceedings pending the outcome of the litigation.
Objections noted. Motion is denied.
Mr. Hearing Officer, if I could join that with just add one point. At least physically in the room, the city witness who was listed and who is in charge of implementing this rule is not present. And I think probably as a result of the moratorium, and I think that severely prejudices the parties who were planning to be able to elicit testimony from that witness. And I think that would be another grounds, perhaps not now, but when we get to that point, where the city asked to testify as the last witness, as you recall. So when we get to that point, I probably would renew the motion of Mr. Rose to at least stay the proceeding until we can have that witness made available. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. City is still welcome to return and participate.
Hearing officer, I would like to join in the objection and the motion. However, the motion I understand from Mr. Rose was brought to the board, not to the hearing officer, to make a decision about moving forward based on its authority. So I would ask for a board vote on that.
I think you're asking for this hearing to be continued or vacated.
I believe the motion that Mr. Rose is bringing would actually fall within the board's jurisdiction, not the delegated authority as a motion from the hearing officer.
Does the board want to take action on that, or?
Yeah, I believe in our order, we delegated anything to the hearing officer in this meeting that we haven't clarified as reserved to the board. So this is something we delegated to the hearing officer, I believe.
Yeah, since it pertains to this hearing, the motion is denied.
I apologize, Mr. Hearing Officer, just wanted to, for the record, note that InTest joins in the motion and the objection as well.
Okay, so noted. We ready to proceed this afternoon? We've got Dr. Jill Johnston or Dr. Unseld. Okay, and she is appearing Dr. Johnston, can you hear us?
Yes, hello.
Dr. Johnston, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I see you. There you are. This is the hearing officer. Do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding?
Yes, I do.
I think you're muted or your microphone is off. So if you can turn up your microphone, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
No.
Did anybody?
Can you try saying something else, Dr. Johnston?
Hello?
You need to turn up your volume. I can barely hear you.
Is that any different?
Maybe the wrong one.
Could it be that the wrong mic is hooked up?
No, I tested this all.
Oh, we can hear you now.
Okay,
Thank you.
so good. Okay.
Do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding, Dr. Johnston?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Dr. Johnston, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Dr. Jill Johnston. I'm an associate professor of environmental health at the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California.
Thank you, Dr. Johnston. And for the record, Dr. Johnston's testimony is in docket number 182, attached as Exhibit 9, and her resume is attached as Exhibit 10. Dr. Johnston, we have heard an overview of your educational background, but would you please briefly summarize your work dealing with the public health impacts from cumulative impacts of air pollution?
Yeah, I'm an environmental health scientist, and I have over 10 years of experience working in environmental epidemiology, exposure assessment, specifically in environmental justice communities or communities that are facing disproportionate burdens of environmental hazards.
Have you had a chance to look at each environmental risk factor, social determinant of health, and health indicator?
Yes, I've reviewed what was sort of proposed in the regulation.
Have you had a chance to review notice version 4?
Yes, I have.
Have you reviewed the version from docket number 180, Exhibit 5?
Yes, I have.
And how about the version from docket number 200, Exhibit 17?
Yes, I have.
So with regards to the environmental risk factors, the social determinants of health, and the health indicators, have you noticed any changes between these documents?
Yes, I believe there was changes in the health indicators to take out the stroke mortality rate. I think corrections around the units of some of the exposures. And sort of a change in how communities of color or race and ethnicity were characterized.
Thank you, Dr. Johnston. How do the cumulative impacts and the interaction of different air pollutants increase health harms?
So there is a wide body of scientific evidence that demonstrates detrimental effects of air pollution on individual and community health. Studies have demonstrated links between air pollution and respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases, and other kinds of health harms. And so social factors or social stressors are important indicators of one's vulnerability to those air pollution harms. We also know that sort of the public health impacts that are oftentimes measured are a consequence of both ambient air pollution and sort of exposures to that air pollution combined with those social stress factors.
You mentioned vulnerability. Can you please describe the concept of vulnerability and susceptibility as it relates to air pollution harms?
Yeah, so generally we consider susceptibility to think about how responsive a person may be to an exposure or like an air pollutant. And this generally has to do with biological or intrinsic factors. Whereas vulnerability will generally describe a combination of those biological factors together with social conditions and environmental conditions that may influence a community response to that air pollution, and this can result in like differences in risks.
Do you ever use those terms interchangeably?
I think I would try to be precise, but I think, you know, oftentimes you'll read and people will use them like similarly.
Okay. And Dr. Johnston, generally speaking, what type of population groups tend to bear the disproportionate health impacts from air pollution?
So we typically find that sort of folks of low resources, low socioeconomic status, indigenous communities and communities of color, children, the elderly, and folks with chronic conditions tend to have be at higher risk for harmful effects of air pollution.
Thank you, Dr. Johnston. Let's go ahead and talk about environmental risk factors. In your written testimony, did you discuss PM 2.5
Yes, I did.
and ozone exposures,
Yes.
diesel particulate matter concentrations,
Yes, I did.
and also traffic proximity and volume?
Yes.
Okay, so in the interest of time, and since you have detailed that throughout your written testimony, would you be willing to give us an overview of how these environmental risk factors, how an increase in those factors can make a community more vulnerable to increases in other air pollutants?
Sure. So generally there's a established body of literature that have linked these different kinds of air pollutants to harmful health effects, sort of ranging from sort of respiratory health to cardiovascular health, then sort of cognitive impacts, sort of both kind of chronic conditions as well as potentially acute effects. And if one's exposure to these pollution increase, those risk factors also increase. And similarly, there's sort of growing evidence that there's additive or synergistic effects. So if you're, you know, living in an already polluted community with one of these pollutants and are exposed to another one, we see kind of additional burdens and health effects in that group.
Do you believe that a high level of exposure to these pollutants would lead to a high level of injury?
Yeah, so generally, as you increase the concentration of ambient air pollution, we see increased health harm for folks that are exposed.
Let's talk about social determinants of health next. So, can you start out by giving us a general idea of what social determinants of health are?
Yeah, these are typically thought of as social factors that increase vulnerability to air pollution harms. So these can include things like race and ethnicity, education levels, linguistic isolation, socioeconomic status, and housing conditions, factors such as those.
Let's talk about communities of color for a little bit. So between the notice version 4 and the version that was filed in docket number 180 exhibit 5, did the articulation of communities of color change?
Yes, I believe it did.
Is the meaning the same between these two versions?
My understanding is that the meaning is similar between those two.
Okay. So communities of color has been articulated as the percent of the population who list their racial status as a race other than white alone and or list their ethnicity as Hispanic or Latino. How do communities of color experience increased vulnerability to air pollution?
So kind of due to sort of historical factors, as well as current practices, we find polluting industries are often concentrated near communities of color, which then will increase their exposures to those ambient air pollutions. National studies have found that Black, Latino, Hispanic, and Native communities also face higher levels of ambient air pollution exposure or air toxics compared to their white counterparts. So these disproportionate exposures to air pollution and air pollution sources can make you more vulnerable to the harms.
Why is it important to consider race and ethnicity specifically?
So there's a strong body of evidence that shows this disproportionality of impact in communities of color, and it cannot fully be explained by just looking at socioeconomic status. So even when we account for poverty or education levels, we still identify gaps, and that's why it's important to include race and ethnicity in addition to these other factors.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I'd like to object as this testimony is duplicative. We've already had a witness talk about almost this exact same information previously. So this is the same kind of expertise and the same opinions we've already elicited.
I have a tendency to agree, but go ahead.
If I may, I would just like to point out that Dr. Clark, while he did mention a few of these factors, he was not intended to be the expert on social determinants of health, while Dr. Johnston is explicitly our expert on social determinants of health. And we have cut down her other testimony regarding the environmental health factors and the health indicators as well.
I'll proceed, but please have her summarize.
Understood.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I was not referring to Dr. Clark. I was referring to Dr. Morello-Frush. That seems to be the similar testimony.
Yeah, I agree, but please summarize, have her summarize.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Dr. Johnston, low-income communities has been articulated as the percent of the population in households with a total household income below 200% of the federal poverty line for the current year. Will you please summarize how low-income communities experience increased vulnerability to air pollution?
Yeah, so typically they face more social stressors and more physical exposures, which can increase their vulnerability to air pollution. So both in terms of living closer to sources or having fewer resources to mitigate those exposures or seek healthcare.
Thank you. And how about people who are linguistically isolated, which has been articulated as the percentage of the population over age 5 that speak a language other than English at home and speaks English less than very well?
Yeah. Similarly, these communities have less access to healthcare and other social services or resources and often face sort of both linguistic and cultural barriers that can increase vulnerability.
Let's talk about education levels briefly. So the education levels have been articulated in the rule as the percent of the population 25 and older who do not have a high school diploma or an equivalent credential. How do less educated people experience increased vulnerability to air pollution?
Yeah. Again, this is sort of an identification of folks that may have less access to resources to mitigate exposures or be more likely to be exposed to different kinds of air pollutants. And we've seen sort of big associations between increased levels of mortality due to air pollution exposures among groups with lower educational attainment.
How do children under the age of 5 experience increased vulnerability to air pollution?
So for children, we see kind of biological and behavioral differences that really drive increased exposures to ambient air pollution, and they tend to be more vulnerable than adults. And so this is partly because their lungs and organs are still developing and they breathe sort of higher volumes of air, may spend more time outside and have more increased contact with the pollutants.
We have one last category on our social determinants of health, So Dr. Johnston, how do the elderly or the people over age 64 experience increased vulnerability?
So there's kind of increased likelihood of chronic conditions among this population, such as cardiovascular disease or respiratory conditions. They can have differences in lung function or immunological function that can increase their vulnerability. Also, cognitive decline can increase one's vulnerability to air pollution. Yeah, and we see that consistent in the data that elderly tend to be more vulnerable to air pollution than adults.
Since these populations that you have discussed, are these groups more likely to experience higher levels of injury from increased exposure to air pollution as well?
Yeah, so when we kind of look at the scientific evidence, these groups face sort of higher health impacts, negative health impacts due to air pollution.
Thank you, Dr. Johnston. Let's chat briefly about health indicators. So did your written testimony discuss asthma for both pediatric and adult populations?
Yes, it did.
How about chronic obstructive pulmonary disease
Yes,
and heart disease?
yes, also.
So will you please briefly summarize how these health indicators are associated with air pollution?
Yeah, so these are considered kind of vulnerable populations because they can be more like susceptible to the impacts of air pollution. It can aggravate pre-existing conditions, or sort of lower doses of air pollution can cause higher harm than like other healthier counterparts.
Does a high prevalence of health indicators in any given community indicate increased vulnerability to air pollution harms?
Yeah, communities that face kind of higher rates of pre-existing conditions are oftentimes more vulnerable to air pollution.
Will you please explain why health indicators are a reliable way to identify an overburdened community?
So there has been kind of established research to indicate that social and economic characteristics of neighborhood areas are associated with broad range of health outcomes. And that these can be indicative of health disparities, which is one of the factors of disproportionate exposure to air pollution can lead to health disparities. And so these kinds of neighborhood level data is really important to kind of consider in understanding community or neighborhood level vulnerability to air pollutants.
Dr. Johnston, in your opinion, how will the proposed rule help protect vulnerable communities from the cumulative effects of air pollution?
Objection, lack of foundation.
Your Honor, the foundation is just summing up all of the questions that we have discussed about the environmental health factors, the health indicators, and the social determinants of health.
Go ahead.
Your Honor, I'm
Thank
sorry.
you.
My objection is that she hasn't provided testimony that she has read and is very familiar with the rule to provide the testimony about how the rule will impact.
I'm going to allow a little leeway. Go ahead.
Thank you. And Dr. Johnston, will you just confirm that you've had a chance to review the past 3 versions of the rule that we discussed earlier in your testimony?
Yeah, I've read the 3 different versions.
Thank you. So based on your expertise in public health and your review of the rule, how will the proposed rule help protect vulnerable communities from the cumulative effects of air pollution?
So with the established foundation of the links between air pollution exposures and health impacts, if you're able to eliminate or avoid additional exposures to air pollution in a given neighborhood, it's anticipated to result in health benefits for that community.
Thank you, Dr. Johnston, for your summaries. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Ms. Locker, Mr. Jantz, do you have any follow-up?
No follow-up, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Mr. Domenici?
Just a few, Mr. Hearing Officer. Good afternoon, Dr. Johnston. My name is Pete Domenici. I represent some of the parties in this proceeding that are in the materials supply construction field and therefore have permits. You said you reviewed the 3 versions of the rules. Have you reviewed the maps that depict those 3 versions?
I received those maps, I think, like right in one of the big PDF documents. So I did look at them, but I didn't like closely review them,
Okay.
but I've seen them.
And have you reviewed any of the proposals by the other parties in this proceeding for different versions of a rule?
No, I have not.
And you're not testifying about how the rule actually functions in terms of what kind of monitoring would be required and what requirements are related to that modeling. Is that
No,
correct?
I'm not.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
I apologize. I was going to ask the board if they had questions before we started the cross-examination. So I went a little bit out of order.
If somebody else wants to.
Board Member Eberline, do you have any questions? Just Marmy, who? No.
Hi, Dr. Johnston. Thank you very much for testifying. I just had a question. NIEHS just came out within the last day or two about how to assess cumulative impacts to inform risk, risk assessments. And the name of the document, I'm pulling it up here right now, is Key Characteristics to Inform Risk Assessment. And it actually looks at synergistic effects between different chemicals. Have you read that by any chance?
I'm sorry, I have not.
Okay. I just want to point that out for the record that this is really incredible. I just received it. It's through the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. And essentially, again, the document's called Key Characteristics Inform Risk Assessment. And it was through funding to UC Berkeley Superfund Research Program. There's been a lot of discussion that you probably weren't here for about how do you actually look at the synergism between these different chemicals and how do you model that? And I'm just wanting to put that into the record that such a resource exists for that. And it's very timely given this hearing. So thank you very much.
Any other questions from the board?
I would like to I'm not sure how a statement like that regarding a new report should be included in the record. It's not coming in through any witness. And I don't think it should be included in the record. I can see it could be a basis of questions, which is fine, but I don't think.
Yes, it was a basis of a question. The question was asked whether or not the witness was familiar with this document. And then there was mentioning of what kind of document it was.
Well, once the witness was unfamiliar, I don't think there's any need to explain and put evidence in the record from board members. They don't file notices of intent. We don't have an opportunity to cross-examine. That's basically kind of an ambush type of document being introduced to the record. So I want to object and move to strike actually all of that except the question, if the doctor had seen it, and the answer that she hadn't.
I'm going to allow it in their discretion. I know that the board member can draw upon their own knowledge and research. So they can draw upon that if they choose. Probably shouldn't be referenced as far as an exhibit is concerned, but they can draw on their own knowledge. Mr. Domenici, you were done with this witness?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Mr. Rose, any questions?
No questions.
Mr. Mollenberg?
No questions, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Mr. Calderon?
No questions for this witness. Thank you.
Ms. Richards?
Thank you. Have you reached any conclusions regarding linguistic isolation with regard specifically to the Mountain View communities?
No, I just referred to the broader scientific evidence.
Does smoking in a household impact asthma rates?
It impacts asthma exacerbation, yes.
Does smoking in the home impact children's specific asthma rates?
It impacts the risk factors for asthma.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Yes.
Have you reached any conclusions regarding the asthma rates in Bernalillo County?
I was not asked to review specific local data.
I'm sorry, you said you haven't.
Reviewed the local data, no.
So at this time, you have no basis to conclude that asthma rates in Bernalillo County are higher than the state average?
I have not reviewed any data, no.
Are all types of cancers related to air pollution?
Any cancer?
Yeah, we're talking about general cancer rates, so I'm wondering, are all different cancers related to air pollution?
I don't believe so, no.
Would it be relevant in assessing impacts from air quality to understand the different types of cancers and those rates in a community?
Can you say that one more time, please?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you again.
Can you say that one more time? Would it be relevant to what?
Would it be relevant in assessing the impacts from air quality to understand the types of cancers and those rates in a community?
If you're interested in understanding like the sort of relationship between exposure to carcinogenic chemicals and cancer rates, then you would want to know both of those things.
But you haven't done any assessment of that, have you?
I have not.
No more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Harris, any questions?
Good afternoon, Dr. John. You hear me?
Yes, good afternoon.
My name is Stan Harris, and I represent INTES in this matter. I have just a couple of questions. Is it your understanding that the proposed rule is designed to address disproportionate health effects suffered by residents of particular neighborhoods in Bernalillo County?
Objection, asked and answered.
If anyone's asked.
Overruled. Go ahead.
Would you like me to repeat the question?
I think I would characterize it as disproportionate exposures to air pollution.
Thank you. Have you specifically analyzed whether residents of any particular neighborhood or census block have been harmed by air emissions as permitted by the Environmental Health Department?
Of New Mexico, I assume.
No, thank you for the clarification. I'll ask the question again with the clarifying term. Have you specifically analyzed whether residents of any particular neighborhood or census block have been harmed by air emissions as permitted by the Albuquerque Environmental Health Department?
I have not.
So the next one's just a slightly different question. Have you specifically analyzed whether residents of any particular neighborhood or census block have been disproportionately harmed by air emissions as permitted by the Environmental Health Department?
I have not.
Thank you. That's all I have.
And we don't have the city or EHD here. Pueblo Visleta, do you have any questions?
The Pueblo Visleta has no questions.
Ms. Kofke? Kofke.
Nothing, sir.
Okay, sorry. Mr. Willard
No questions, sir.
and Ms. Amino, I assume that she's not going to have any questions. If there's any redirect, very brief.
Dr. Johnston, I just have one really quick question for you. Do you need to know the local data to know that the factors that you discussed today can increase a community's vulnerability if they possess those factors?
I think we can rely on the wide scientific evidence to sort of understand and estimate those potential risk factors within any given community.
Is it your opinion that the science that you discuss is very well established?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Johnston. No further questions.
Thank you. That was 2 questions. That's fine. Any follow-up from the board? Okay. I understand you still have Dr. Unseld, and we also have Dr. O'Donnell from petitioners, but.
Yes, Dr. Unseld.
Okay. Dr. Unseld, can you hear us?
Give me a moment. I'm getting her on screen. What was her full name again, please?
Monica Unseld.
She may need a moment to log in. I think we are expecting to be a little bit later, but she's definitely attempting.
There she is. Dr. Unseld, can you hear me okay? This is the hearing officer.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Unseld. This is Gabe Pisiniak. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and offer your expertise. Can you start by stating your name for the record, please?
Yes, my name is Monica Unseld.
Can I just let the record show that Dr. Unseld's pre-written testimonies in docket 182, exhibit 11, and her curriculum vitae is exhibit 12 in the same docket. Dr. Unseld, can you briefly summarize your educational background?
Yes, I'm going to disaggregate it a little bit because I know there was some concern.
If you can slow down just a moment
Okay.
and repeat, please.
We have a very hardworking court reporter here.
And also being on Zoom.
My apologies.
If you can
Yes.
turn up your mic if you have
Okay.
that opportunity.
Is this better?
A little bit
How is this?
better, but
If you can project more, that'd be great.
Okay. So are we ready or do we need more
Yes.
time?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I want to go over my educational background because I know that there has been some concern about qualifications. So I have a bachelor's in science and biology, a doctorate in biology and a master's in public health. When you get a doctorate in biology, you learn about qualitative and quantitative research. You learn about how to see data gaps, how to ask new research questions, how to reject hypotheses. You also learn about bias. And when you're getting a degree in public health, you learn about language justice, as well as the social and political determinants of health. And between the time of my biology doctorate and my master's in public health, that's when I started working with EJ communities through Coming Clean. And that's where I really started to use qualitative data in real time.
Thank you, Dr. Unseld. And could you also summarize some of the highlights from your work background as regards your testimony?
Yes, and I will say that in my case, peer-reviewed publications is not a good metric for what I do. I work in the sort of intersection of the academy and community work. So what you'll see is my appointment to some committees was due to community support and buy-in, not only from community groups, but from groups like Earth Justice, Union of Concerned Scientists, and National Resources Defense Council. So I will say that my career and my abilities within academia and working with communities has led me to serve on an ad hoc EPA fence line screening methodology committee. That report has been published. I am currently on a National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine committee looking at the climate and economic justice screening tool, particularly when it comes to utilizing community engagement. One thing that is not on my CV because it is not published yet is a book chapter that I co-wrote for a book that will be a public health textbook that will be published by Springer Publications and edited by Dr. Natasha Desjardins and Dr. Natalie Sampson. And the chapter I co-wrote was on community engagement.
Thank you, Dr. Unseld. Can you explain why is it important to provide opportunities for communities to meaningfully be involved in developing data for air pollution control policymaking?
There's multiple benefits of having community involvement. One is you have increased community support, buy-in, and partnership. Second, and this is a very important one, you get validity. Yes, modeling is important, but you need to have validity that what you're working on, the processes, the outcomes, the inputs, the processes, the outcomes are rooted in the reality of what is actually happening in the community. If you do not have validity, then the entire process, the inputs, the process, the outcomes have less value. Now, this is also very important. You need community input to have the best possible science. It is not the best possible science to decide who is going to be ignored simply because they may have less resources or may not have a peer-reviewed publication. That is, in my opinion, not good science.
Thank you. And can you describe what are some of the developments in science-based data collection, in the science-based data collection field when it comes to incorporating people's lived experience into the process of air pollution policymaking?
Well, as a whole, we're seeing a greater acceptance of it, particularly using mixed methodologies and integrative methodologies, which is just science likes to use overly fancy words, but it's just like a technical way of saying we're using qualitative and quantitative data. And we're seeing this from the federal government in that I pulled this up so I could say this correctly. The executive order on tackling the climate crisis, at home and abroad, which was January 27th, 2021, President Biden has told all agencies to include community engagement in their work. So that right there is huge. Because I remember being in those discussions where it wasn't. And it's important to note that the federal government, when you work for them, they train you. They will not do anything that they do not believe will stand up in court. So for them to believe that lived experience and community engagement will stand up in court, I believe is very important information.
And can you, more specifically, can you describe what is community-based participatory research and how does it relate to lived experience?
So community-based participatory research, some people keep it under the heading of community engagement as under that umbrella, but it's when community groups, they either work with decision makers, they work with universities, they work with governing bodies to discuss what the research questions are, meaning what is the information we'd like to find out, how are we going to collect the data, what data will we collect, and then how will we disseminate the data. And all of this has community input, so it's not the traditional way that we think of research, where as an academic, I was trained to go to the library and read peer review research and build from there, never once speaking with the community and then sticking the research behind the paywall. The important thing about this is with community-based participatory research, which I may start calling CBPR, just for shorthand, is it's going to reveal these data gaps. You're going to get different routes of exposure. So for example, sometimes we forget that with our indigenous nations, there's a route of exposure that comes through cultural traditions. That's not through drinking or breathing. You're going to get more information on potential impacts, and you're going to get that information in real time. But most importantly, you're going to have validity, and you'll have some community-led data collection as well, which will all, again, lead to that validity and the usefulness of the work.
And is CBPR or community-based participatory research accepted in the scientific field?
Yes, so in earlier formations, you may have heard the term citizen science, but it's sort of been refined with input from the community to make it less extractive. So it's not a new concept, it's a more refined concept with more input from community as to how we can best work together.
Have you reviewed the definition of community-based participatory research in the proposed regulation in the version 4, which is docket 140? It's on page 6, definition F, and that's the same definition that's in the proposed amendments in docket 182 and proposed amendments in docket 200?
Yes.
And
yes.
Is that definition in keeping with the scientific understanding of community-based participatory research?
Yes, because there's also a factor here that the community-based participatory research is going to be defined with community input. So if the community says, this is how we are defining it, then that's how it will be defined.
Thank you. And have you reviewed the provisions of version 4 that allow for the use of community-based participatory research by the department in making a determination of whether to grant a permit? That's in docket 140 at page 17, 72.12B4. And I'm just asking you for your opinion, not on the standard for denial, just on the use of CBPR in being considered by the decision maker.
Yes.
And is that, generally speaking, is that in keeping with the best science of how community data collection can inform the regulatory process?
Yes, and I even have an example of that here from where I am in Louisville, Kentucky. We have a strategic toxic air reductions program. So we have local control of our air, which is run through our air pollution control district. But so what the program does is it permits how many emissions a facility is allowed to release. Those policies, the regulatory actions of this came from when they did joint research with the community group called the West Jefferson Community Task Force. And they were taking, the community was taking air samples. So that set up the standards for the STAR program that says, if you want to, you're allowed to emit this much. And if you want to release more emissions, you have to come to us and you will have to get a permit for that. But we also now have an app called the Smell My City app, where anyone in Louisville can pull over, or if you're walking, and put in where you are, the time of day, the characteristics of the odor and any symptoms, and someone from the Air Pollution Control District or the University of Louisville will go out and investigate, and based on that data, these facilities may get fined.
Thank you, Dr. Unseld. I'm going to switch, I have just a couple more questions, but we're going to switch to the topic of providing notice, adequate notice, and language access provisions. Can you just speak generally, what is the importance of having effective notice and language access provisions in an environmental permitting process?
Communities need to have the information they need to take protective harm, but also to plan. So if you think about it in the notice provision, there's the opportunity to work with decision makers and say, here's our concerns, but they can't do that if they don't fully get the notification that they need in a means that's accessible and comfortable to them. And if there should be an information where they need to take protective actions for themselves and their loved ones, they will also need those enhanced provisions to take those actions. When it comes to environmental justice, I've been in EPA committee, I've been in other meetings and hearings, and I've heard the industry say that communities don't want to know more information because it scares them. In my 15 years of doing this, I have never met a community say, we don't want more information. They already know. They need this notice, and it will only help.
Dr. Unseld, are you aware that the notice provisions that are in proposed regulation version 4 were suggested in part by the community members that I represent, Dr. Sofia Martinez and Manuel Criollo?
Yes.
And what is the value of having enhanced notice provisions that have been suggested by community members themselves?
The fact that it's suggested, not only the suggestion of the enhanced notices, but I think everything that's happening now with this hearing, all of this is qualitative data. All of this is something that cannot be ignored. The community is asking for this enhanced provisions, better notices, but this entire hearing is qualitative data suggesting that we may need to look at some things. So I think that, again, is that frontline real-time information.
Thank you. And then to wrap up with some questions about the language access provisions in particular, have you reviewed the definition of language spoken in an overburdened community, which is in docket 182, exhibit 13, page 166, which defines that as a language spoken by more than 3% of the population in a specific census tract?
Yes.
In your opinion, is 3% of is it reasonable to provide interpretation or translation services when over 3% of the population in a census tract speaks that language?
Yes, and I will also add that the federal government tends to rely on data sets that are easily to obtain. And this data set is easy to obtain. So therefore, this is a reasonable request.
And where can you obtain that data set from?
The census.
Thank you. And I believe you provided the exact census table in your testimony. And last question, do you think these language access provisions are necessary?
Absolutely. Again, if you would like that community buy-in, support, partnership to say, hey, we would love to work with you on this, but also people have a right to know. People have a right to know what they need to do to protect themselves and their loved ones.
Thank you very much. No further questions.
Thank you. Does the board have any questions? Board member Armijo? Ms. Richards?
I just have a couple of questions. Let me get the microphone. I have so many things here. Got dinner and everything else. So thank you for presenting. I was wondering with CBPR whether or not the community research ultimately in some cases ends up in peer-reviewed journal articles.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with the group called Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Their research, well, first of all, they can do their own blood draws, but they have published multiple times in peer-reviewed journals.
Okay. And so that kind of, again, does that inform the science then after the fact? Because it is peer-reviewed?
Yes, but I will say with peer review, there's a plus and con to peer review. Of course, it's the standard for science, and what's the standard we have, right? But sometimes data can get locked behind a paywall when it goes behind peer review. So there are groups who will publish it in a very technical way, but then they may work with another organization like Project Tender to make sure it's translated and easily accessible.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm getting over a cold. The other question I had, you had mentioned something in Kentucky about, and I didn't get the name of that program, but it was about number of emissions from a facility. And I just am asking you to go ahead and repeat that for me.
It's
if you
okay.
don't
So
mind.
the shorthand is the STAR program. So it's the Strategic Toxic Air Reductions Program.
Okay.
And they do have evidence that it has decreased toxins in the air locally.
And when you said number of emissions allowed from facility, can you just describe what that is?
So
is that
if,
volume?
Yeah, so if Keymore
Okay.
wants to emit more, they have to apply for a permit.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
I'm sorry, if Keymores would like to emit more of a chemical, they have to apply for a permit.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had.
The hearing officer. Hi, thank you, doctor. Just a few questions. Sorry, what was that last word you said? I didn't catch the last word.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said the Keymores. It's the name of a company that's here locally.
Oh, so it's a specific company that this
Yeah,
is
I'm
about?
sorry. I was just using that as an example.
Okay.
I guess I could say facility A. No, sorry.
Facility A. Okay, great.
Yes.
That helps. My question is also about the STAR. So it was, if the STAR, you said it came from a joint task force and the community took air samples. How did those samples inform the permitting regime?
Well, first they helped to highlight that the community was telling the truth about the emissions, because unfortunately, many times community members come with these concerns and the industry will come back and say, no, that's not true. But they also, by working with AQCB, where they have the stationary monitors, so you have the handheld monitors, which are the commercial monitors, and then you have the stationary, like sort of government ones. If you can show on the stationary government ones and the handheld that there's emissions increasing, then that's providing some validation there, kind of saying, look, both forms of monitors are showing an increase in this toxin in these zip codes, especially when they decided to go out to the eastern zip codes and there were not those increased levels of toxic chemicals present.
Okay, thank you. So it was something that essentially validated data on the ground, the handheld community-based information. Did it require anything in the so did it mean that, did that data add to any permitting rule? Like, was there then a need for a control technology, et cetera?
Well, yes, the data they obtained from that, and I will say even before that, they were doing bucket brigades, which I know, some courts don't like, and it's easy to push back on those. But in concert with the bucket brigades, the consistency in going to Metro Council meetings and this commercial air monitoring data, it's kind of said, look, we need to get a better control on this, that there are too many air toxins for our liking in these zip codes. So those went into the actual creation of the STAR program and where those levels would be for that permitting, my apologies.
No, that's, you're helping me understand. So it created a threshold?
Yes. And
Okay.
it kind of said, you cannot pollute any more than this.
And is there a regulation now in Kentucky based on that threshold?
Well, we have local control of our air. And I'm sure it may be the same in New Mexico, where we have that urban rural divide. So this is something that we see here in Louisville.
Right. Sorry. What I'm trying to get at is, because we're in a rulemaking proceeding, I'm trying to get at, is there already did Kentucky already do this?
Oh, yeah, the STAR program started in 2005.
Okay. Does the STAR program regulate I apologize. I don't know about the
Okay,
STAR
sorry.
program. And if it was in your testimony, I need to
No
recall that.
worries.
I'm not recalling it, so I apologize. What I'm trying to get at is there a requirement such as the requirements we're considering today based on that? Are there changes to the permitting process in Kentucky in this local control area? They are toxic.
Okay,
What
so
did you say?
there's like a federal level, but then the APCD says, well, just to get these toxins under control, we're going to put another cap on it.
So there's a new standard of toxins in the STAR.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. I think that I can at least look at that. Yeah, no further questions.
Board Member Eberline, any questions? Board Member Kalman? Board Member Galuski?
Just one question. Are you aware of any best practices that are available for communities to ensure that the data they're collecting is reliable and sound, and that it will be received by regulatory agencies and used and respected as good data?
Well, the EPA has some technical assistance centers to assist communities. Communities can apply for this assistance.
Okay, that's fine.
And
Thank you.
I just want to go back to the STAR program because I don't want to have a brain fry. So I think like there's a level, but there's an extra like cap. But I think just for the safest bet, I'm going to say perhaps that should just be looked up because my brain is in like a little string bean right now. So sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Jens or Ms. Locke, do you have any follow-up questions?
I just have one question, and if it's all right with you, Judge Sanchez, I'll just do it from here.
That's fine.
Hi, Dr. Unseld. My name is Maslin Locke. I represent the petitioners. I know you said you were familiar with the definition of languages spoken in an overburdened community being 3% or more of the population. In your opinion, if that percentage was limited to, say, I don't know, hypothetically 30% of the people in the overburdened community, would that achieve the goal of making sure notice was accessible to everyone in an overburdened community?
So are you asking that if they only made it accessible to languages where only 30% were spoken? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, Dr. Unseld.
I think that's going to leave a lot of people without the information they need.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Unseld. I have nothing else.
Thank you. Mr. Domenici?
Just a couple of questions. Dr. Unseld, in looking at your testimony, I was trying to find examples of community data gathering, and I saw air sampling, and then I think I saw a reference to an odor kind of sampling in your testimony. It's called Smell My City app. Are those the primary forms of data that are gathered when we are discussing community data, would be air sampling?
No. I mentioned earlier that Alaska Community Air Action on Toxics takes blood samples, there's water samples. I'm not sure what you're asking, so.
Well, we're in the air permitting process here, or air permit rulemaking. So I just want to be sure, we keep using the word data. I'm trying to make sure I have an understanding that that data would primarily consist of air sampling, or is there something else that is included?
There are some sensors that can be attached to smartphones where you can go around and collect air samples through your smartphones. There are systems that you can put in backpacks. There are systems that you can attach to your phone. Now, some are run through the app, but there are multiple things, and there are more. This is a society where we have multiple inventions, and there are multiple types of commercial air monitors. So depending on what chemical you would like to look at, yes, but that's going to be on standard because the government tends to use stationary air monitors.
But again, just my question is, we're talking about air monitoring, a whole different variety of ways, but that's the main type of data that we're discussing with respect to these air permit issues. Is that correct?
Yes.
And if you know, do those monitors, I know there's a range of sampling opportunities, do they collect, what kind of data do they collect in comparison to what we might call criteria pollutants or hazardous air pollutants, if you know?
It really depends on the manufacturer and the type. However, the fact that the federal government is embracing not only this technology, the EPA has a website on the different air monitors. I would say that this data is acceptable. I'm
trying to get beyond this data. I'm trying to identify the data. Is that data in air monitoring that shows hazardous air pollutants? If you know.
There probably are, yes.
Okay.
I mean, I guess my concern is we're splitting hairs here, trying to disqualify it by splitting hairs, saying it doesn't picture this one. Therefore, we're going to try to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that's not acceptable. And in a researcher, I haven't given enough evidence to say, like, if it doesn't collect HAPs, that we need to reject what the community is asking for.
I'm just trying to find out what's available and what could be expected, because there's a rule here dictating that the board consider community-based data. And so I think the board deserves to know what kind of data that might be when they're considering that. So if you're not able to testify as to whether the air monitoring might or might not include HAPs, that's fine. I'm just trying to find out.
Well, no, I mean, but I'm also, you know, I'm aware of your term dictating as well. The air monitoring may include HAPs. So I will say, yes, we'll have to do a web search on that, but I'm not going to say no.
Okay, but sitting here today, you don't know what kind of data the air monitoring actually gathers. Is that a fair statement?
I mean, I don't know. I really don't know what you're talking about.
And then have you seen any, what you would consider community data gathered by the petitioners in this case, or available from the petitioners in this particular jurisdiction we're dealing with out here in New Mexico?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Domenici. Mr. Rose?
Mr. Hearing Officer, I have no questions, but I had a question of Professor Pasiniak, and there are documents being referred to. Are those the documents that are in the footnotes in Dr. Unselt's testimony, and if they're not, are you planning on making those available and submitting those for the record?
I believe the STAR program is referred to, and the census tables are referred to in footnotes. If there's a specific, I believe that all the documents are in the footnotes. If there's a specific one that you have a question about, Mr. Rose, be happy.
No, I'm just trying to get confirmation that that's where we should look. Mr. Hearing Officer, so I have no questions.
Thank you. Mr. Mullenberg?
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer. Dr. Unseld, my name is Dalva Mullenberg. I represent the New Mexico Mining Association and the New Mexico Chamber of Commerce. I have a couple of questions. Let me start with your testimony supporting the concept that if over 3% of a targeted population speaks a language in an area, then it's considered to be spoken for purposes of the public notice language translation requirements. You're nodding your head, so you're okay. Sounds like you understand what I'm asking about here. The 3% comes from a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Committee recommendation. Is that right?
Yes.
Are you aware of different thresholds other than 3% in other authoritative guidelines or recommendations?
I am aware of the 3%, but I do know in public health, you try to reach every single language that's spoken, period. So I think 3% is best practice.
Thank
you.
And you're familiar with the rule language that your clients have proposed relating to this issue, are you?
Can you specify which language?
Well, I'm talking about the language that refers to when translation is required where a language is spoken.
So yes, what is your question?
Okay, but yeah, let me get to the question. So I'm a little bit curious, given your testimony, when I compare that with the proposed rule language, it appears to strike the provision saying that a language is considered to be spoken and therefore presumably subject to a translation requirement if at least 3% of the targeted population speak it. And I'm curious as to if you're aware of that strikeout and why that language would have been stricken.
I am not aware of that.
Okay, thank you. My other questions, as I read your testimony, it sounds like you recognize the importance of data validation and the use of appropriate scientific protocols when you're gathering and reporting and using data in community-based participation, CBPR. You're nodding your head yes, I believe.
Yes,
is that right?
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
the court reporter can't see
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I
nods.
am. I'm sorry.
Right. You talk about in your written direct testimony, and I'm referring to docket 182, exhibit 11, page 142, on integrative methodology and mixed methods research. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Written testimony? There's a statement in there that I'm going to read. It says these mixed method approaches incorporate more traditional notions of scientific rigor by relying on long-standing scientific protocols. And then you go on to talk about the use of qualitative data based on lived experience of community members. You're nodding your head yes?
Yes. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, 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 yes.
I just want to make sure the record shows that you're following me here. When you're talking about long-standing scientific protocols, can you give me an example of the kind of thing that you're talking about there?
That could be air monitoring, it could be blood draws, it could be a survey. There are multiple different protocols. I mean, you could work with animal studies.
Okay. That maybe jumped ahead to my question because I was going to talk about the distinction between data and qualitative methods. You mentioned a survey, for example. That might be an example of a qualitative qualitative set of data or information?
Well, I want to be clear. You're trying to make it as if there's data and then there's qualitative. They are not separate. And fortunately, we know that the federal government is not going to pursue anything that it feels it cannot defend in court. And we have multiple agency websites calling for qualitative data. So I think we're good on whether or not this is, it's going to uphold in court, whether or not researchers at the agencies and in the federal government feel there's not a weight behind it. But we cannot continue to do this separate. There's data and they're qualitative, because that's simply not true. They're all data forms.
Yeah, just so you understand, I'm not really challenging the use of qualitative data or how it is at this point. I'm just trying to understand what you're talking about. But I think a survey would be a good example of qualitative data.
Yeah, or a focus group.
Yeah.
Focus group, or this entire hearing. The fact that they've done all of this to have this hearing. This is qualitative data right here.
Right.
In real time.
And again, whether it's CBPR information, we've talked about the need for the use of appropriate scientific protocols and the like.
I just want to call out, we keep using this term appropriate scientific protocols. I've done work against industry before, and I know that the motive is trust the science, but it's science as you determine it. But I mentioned earlier about bias. With bias, if someone can have their profits or their material goods are impacted by an outcome, then that immediately puts an asterisk by the word. So when you say appropriate scientist, that to me has an asterisk in its head, because I know your version of appropriate is not going to be what's in favor of the community.
Right. In other words, there always may be disagreement about what's appropriate and whether it meets scientific protocols and the like.
Well, what I'm saying is, like, the industry does not get to make that call because there's an asterisk. Yeah, that's
bias. Yeah,
that's bias. Yeah.
The industry doesn't maybe get to make that call, but somebody might need to make that call, and that really goes to the point of my last.
Go ahead.
My last question, which gets to the definition of community-based participatory research, which, as I understand it in the proposed rule, is required to be considered by the EHD in a couple of different contexts. One would be when the EHD is mapping overburdened communities. Is that right?
Yes. I believe so, yes.
The other, yeah, the other is when it's being considered in the context of a particular permit proceeding.
Yes.
The definition of community-based participatory research doesn't reference the use of scientific data collection methods or any particular scientific standard. And I guess my ultimate question to you is, given your recognition that any data that's going to be used and particularly mandated to be considered in the way it is in the rule, whether you would have any objection to including appropriate language concerning the scientific data validation, appropriateness, whatever is the right term, so that concept can at least be considered by EHD when it's mandated to consider CBPR data.
I would, but not if industry gets to define it, because again, there's that profit, there's that property, which is a red flag for bias, which means that we take everything with a grain of salt. So if community members they have experts in their lived experience, and the federal government is now saying, yes, their lived experience, we will fight for it in court, decide to work with some independent researchers to come up with some language, then yes, I would support that.
Right. And I believe in the context of the rule, it would actually be EHD most likely that would be considering how to incorporate and consider CBPR data. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, but I would just, again, just remind that there's no place for the industry in defining this work.
Thank you, Dr. Ansel. That's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. Calderon, any questions?
No questions for this witness. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Richards? And Tuss wants to go first. Mr. Harris?
Good afternoon, Dr. Ansel. Can you hear me?
Yes,
My name is Stan Harrison. I represent INTES in this matter.
yes,
I understand that you're familiar with the rule and that you're familiar with the term overburdened community. Is that correct?
yes.
Okay. I just have two questions for you. Have you specifically analyzed whether residents of any particular neighborhood or census block have been harmed?
Objection. Oh, I'm sorry. Continue. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Thank you. Have you specifically analyzed whether residents of any particular neighborhood or census block have been harmed by air emissions as permitted by the Albuquerque Environmental Health Department?
Objection. Outside the scope. Dr. Unseld was only asked to testify about the CBPR and public engagement portions of the rule.
I'll allow the question. You can answer, Dr. Unseld.
Would you mind repeating that, please?
Absolutely, Dr. Unseld. The question is, have you specifically analyzed whether residents of any particular neighborhood or census block have been harmed by air emissions as permitted by the Albuquerque Environmental Health Department?
I have analyzed the qualitative data that shows that they show concern. So in the absence of solid evidence that this phenomena is not happening, I cannot reject the qualitative data that I have seen.
So what is the qualitative data? The qualitative data that
The qualitative data is that they are seeking changes and they are reporting self-reports. But in the absence of solid evidence that what they're reporting is not true, as a researcher, I cannot just choose to ignore the qualitative data that they are presenting.
Who is they? When you say
The
they,
community groups
And
and the clients.
okay,
clients.
which community is that?
Bernalillo County, is that pronouncing that correctly?
Bernalillo?
I'm so sorry. Yes.
No, that's okay.
I'm so sorry.
So Bernalillo County has.
Well, I would say the qualitative data is that residents who have brought this petition and this hearing together have some concerns, and I don't have enough data right now to reject that data that they are saying this is the problem. So I don't have enough data to say that what they are saying is false.
Okay, thank you. And I'll ask a slightly different question. Have you specifically analyzed whether residents of any particular neighborhood or census block have been disproportionately harmed by air emissions as emitted by the Albuquerque Environmental Health Department?
Objection. Outside the scope of Dr.
I understand. I'll allow it.
This is going to be the same answer that I told you before. I've known some of these clients for years, and I've known that they've dealt with environmental justice issues for years, but I do not have the solid evidence coming from the county or the city or industry saying that they are not telling the truth. So as a researcher, I cannot reject that qualitative data. So I have seen that data. I have seen it. We've met, we've talked about it. I've seen presentations on it. So I cannot reject it.
Is that data part of, have you submitted that data to any party in this matter?
No, but I'm sure that that it's in the petition and everything that brought this hearing together. So I'm sure you've seen it.
So the data that you are referring to, that is the qualitative data that you believe exists to support a claim that there has been a disproportionate effect even in the face of Albuquerque air permitting. that you think the qualitative data that exists is in the petition. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it's in the petition. And also, I think that we need to, this emphasis of sort of saying it's not, or it's something that we believe. Again, this is a gross misuse of science. For someone who has a biased interest as a researcher and an advocate for science, I'm not going to go along with that line that somehow qualitative data is made up or it's in the face of permitting, because again, you all do not get to decide what is real data and what is not real data. If you all want to say that this is not happening, then I do believe that you all have had decades to present the data saying that these chemicals are safe. In the absence of that data, I cannot reject calls to look for an alternative. As scientists, we are trained to reject a hypothesis. We've got decades of data, not just here, but across the world, that are saying there are health disparities in these areas where these chemicals are being emitted. Where is the data saying that they're not related? In the absence of that data, it is wholly irresponsible, and again, a misuse of science to say what they're saying is somehow less rigorous or make-believe. If the safety data was there, I'm sure that all of you would be proudly showing it off.
So the extent of the data that you are relying on for your opinion is in the petition, correct?
Going to be here to testify. Yes, because you are defining data narrowly that will suit your cause, and I'm defining data like a scientist, which just means information. So yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Ms. Richards, do you have any follow-up?
Good afternoon, Dr. Unseld. My name is Dory Richards.
If you could speak
Good
into the
afternoon.
microphone. Don't break it.
I'm trying to fix the microphone and it's not going well. My name is Dory Richards and I represent a variety of federal parties and interests in this matter: the Department of Energy, the National Nuclear Security Administration, Air Force, Space Force, Kirtland Air Force Base, just a variety of entities from the federal government. So I wanted to start, I was confused by some of your direct testimony, so I need clarification to help me understand that. So on page 140 of your testimony, around line 62 through 70, you reference this phrase, whether the work is appropriate or effective. And I'm trying to understand what that kind of vague term work means. Did you mean data collection?
Could you read some more of the sentence, please?
Yeah, the question was, why is it important to provide ways for the community to meaningfully be involved in developing data for air pollution control policymaking? And you say meaningful community engagement has multiple benefits, including increased buy-in support. It goes on and it says, meaning that you're getting a more direct feedback regarding whether the work is appropriate or effective. And I'm trying to understand what work means.
Oh yes, the work means everything, from initial planning to development, to when you're carrying it out, to when you're evaluating it, to when you're revising it to make changes. The work is the entire process, which hopefully is like a circle because you're evaluating and refining as you go.
So I'm still confused. When you say the entire process, what process you're talking about?
Whatever the work is that the community is asking to participate on.
Well, the heading of the section is, does community-led data collection lead to meaningful community involvement? So in that context, what does work mean?
So how are you defining data collection, first of all?
How are you defining work? That's what I'm trying to
well,
understand.
No, I'm trying to ask, because I'm trying to see if it was like the person who came before you who had a very narrow definition of data, and we need to straighten that out first. Because what I've said is work.
One at a time, please.
Yeah,
I'm seeking to also clarify data collection later. So my first question was, when you say it can also better ensure the validity of the work, what did you mean by the work? Did you mean data collection? Did you mean a rulemaking process? Did you mean something else?
All of it.
All of it. So the work means absolutely anything that could possibly occur.
Yes, that's what I said earlier. Yes.
And can you also, I guess, provide me with a little bit of clarity? When you talk about a community, do you mean, the general sense of everyone who works there, lives there, exists there, engages significantly in the location?
That is something that each community has to define for itself.
So there's no generally accepted definition of community?
I'm sure you could go to the dictionary, but in EJ work, we're typically looking at those who are disproportionately impacted. But again, the beauty of proper and best practices in community engagement and community participation is to allow the community to define that, particularly if they're going to partner with decision makers, then they will define who the stakeholders will be.
So as I stand here today, I can define community as just the board, and that's their own community. And I could also define people over here as their own community, and that's all okay.
Well, if you want to do just general, but for environmental justice, it's going to be disproportionately impacted. Now, within disproportionately impacted, they may define other people. They may just say, well, we're looking at residents, but we may want to also look at workers, right? But in this case, you'll have to go with what the residents here, the community here said. And again, I know you said it could be you, but the industry, that's that bias flag. And I know that the U.S. military as well has some bias, so.
Well, I don't work for the military, ma'am, but let me ask you this. Isn't it true that inherently most people have some type of bias?
That's not the type of bias I'm talking about. I'm talking about the bias they teach you when they train you to become a researcher, which is that if you have a profit or a material outcome that could be impacted by the decision, then you have to step back. That's the type of bias I'm talking about that you learn in graduate school.
When you have expectations of a particular outcome, isn't it true that the inputs that you put in there can be biased? If you're expecting a particular outcome, I'm going to clarify that. Isn't it true that you want to have biased inputs to make sure that outcome occurs?
That's not proper research. That's why we have community-based participatory research where they work with researchers and decision makers to make sure that doesn't happen. However, it still stands that with industry, when you've got profit, I mean, this is research 101. This is a huge flag.
Again, to clarify, isn't it true that when there is an expectation of a certain outcome, there are generally biases in the inputs to ensure that outcome occurs?
Objection, asked and answered.
It was not, Your Honor. I'm just
Well,
asking.
if you can just surmise, Dr. Enselt.
I know what she's trying to get at, and I'm going to answer it this way. Not in this case, because when people are trying to survive, you asked me to surmise, I'm surmising.
I didn't ask you anything about this case, ma'am. I asked you generally of the concept. Please answer my question.
Not when people are trying to survive, no.
So your testimony today under oath is that when someone has an expectation of outcome, they do not have a bias on the inputs to ensure that outcome is reached. Is that your
That's
testimony?
not what I said. That's not what I said.
Then can you clarify what you said, ma'am?
I said when people are trying to survive, they do not.
So there's no bias in the inputs ever?
That's not what I said.
Again, Dr. Enselt, I'm going to have to ask you actually answer my question.
I
understand
am.
you have a different, there's going to be a redirect and you'll have the opportunity to answer other questions, but I'd like my question answered.
I did, and I understand that you don't like my answer.
No, I'm just trying
Objection,
to.
Your
Ms.
Honor.
Richards, just move on. Ms. Richards, move on. She's answered it to the best of her ability.
Is it your opinion that community-specific data is necessary to assessing environmental justice shortcomings?
Yes.
In your opinion, is it important to consider current, up-to-date data in assessing environmental justice shortcomings rather than relying on generalized national data?
Objection, outside the scope.
Overruled. You can answer.
Can she repeat that, please?
In your opinion, is it important to consider current, up-to-date data rather than relying on general national data and assessing environmental justice shortcomings?
You need both.
You need both. In your opinion, do environmental interventions lack relevance if not tied to a community's identified stressors?
Yes.
Would a regulation lacking in community data also be lacking generally?
Yes.
Would an environmental justice rule that primarily relies upon assumptions and theoretical models be insufficient to address actual community intervention needs?
Yes.
Dr. Ounce, I would like to ask some clarification about your direct testimony at page 145, beginning at line 161. And I can paraphrase it. And the question is, have you reviewed the definition of community-based participatory research in the proposed regulation? And they have a citation, and your answer is yes. So my question is, your testimony was submitted on November 17th of this year. Did it change after that date?
No.
I needed to ask that so I know that you're looking at version 4 of the rule, because that's the version that existed on that date.
Yes.
So my question is the definition of community-based participatory research the best practice, or did you mean the concept of community-based participatory research is the best practice?
Both.
So you think that that definition is also the very same as the concept, that definition
No.
cannot?
Best practice is best. It doesn't mean I'm saying that's the best definition. Best practice is saying that whatever the community decides is what needs to be happening. So both.
So let me ask you this. Could that definition be improved?
If the community and the people they're working with decide to revise that, then that is completely up to them.
And if the Air Quality Control Board could change that definition and improve it, would that be all right too?
As long as they're working with the community, yes.
Now, you also reference, and I have the same question about a couple of provisions, because you say best practice or best science. With regard to the next question, which is at lines 169 through 171 at page 145 of your direct testimony, you've looked at provision 20.11.72.12b4.
Yes, Miss Denny, is this the time for me to say yes?
Okay. And again, that language is acceptable, but there is the likelihood that it could potentially be improved. Is that correct?
Yes, that's with community-based participatory research and with community buy-in, you're forming these relationships and these partnerships. And so it's really the last word is up. It's not up to me, it's up to the community.
And then just one last question about the notice and language. I know we talked about the 3% before. Let me ask you this. If in a community, there was one household who spoke both English and French, and it was the only household, should notice be provided in French as well?
That would be up to the community to decide.
From your perspective though, with regard to notice, you're an expert.
I am an expert, and the expert best practice is to say that that is a decision that the community makes. I mean, maybe I need to send some more references in, but that is best practice to say that. I mean, if you can think about in public health, where you have to have every representation language, if you're in like a public health clinic, you need to have it available. So again, I'm not I feel
Let me
like
ask you this,
this,
to
Mhm.
paraphrase your testimony then, in your opinion, every single language, no matter how little or much spoken, notice should always be provided in all of those. Is that fairly
I did
accurate?
not say that. I did not say that. I
All
said
right,
it would be
thank
up to the community.
Thank you, ma'am. No more questions.
Thank you. City of Albuquerque HD has not returned for questioning. Isleta Pueblo, do you have any questions?
No, sir. The Pueblo of Isleta has no questions.
Thank you. Ms. Nafke, any questions?
No, sir.
Mr. Willard?
No questions, sir.
And I'm going to assume that Ms. Semino does not have any questions. Short redirect?
Thank you, Dr. Unseld, for your testimony. Just about done here. Just a couple of quick follow-ups for you. Since it's come up so often, could you just define what is qualitative data?
Qualitative data is data that cannot be turned into a number. So on the one end, you could say a painting or a song is providing you information, but it's anytime that you get information that cannot be put into a number, and it's necessary because life cannot be put into a number. Life cannot be put into a spreadsheet. So yes, qualitative data, it is just as valuable as quantitative data. We have a false assumption that numbers are better in this society. That is not true. And even if you want to get into the neuroscience, your emotional brain is necessary for you to learn. So you've got to get those emotions and those non-numbers going for your brain to make decisions. So it's basically any information that cannot be in numerical form.
Would public comment in a rulemaking hearing, for example, would that constitute qualitative data?
Absolutely. And the federal government relies on those all of the time.
Thank you. And there were some questions about whether or not a rule that just relied on hypothetically national data and modeling would be sufficient to address environmental justice. I want to ask you in particular, do you think that a rule that hypothetically relied on the EJ screen tool combined with an opportunity for community members to provide community-based participatory research, could that be a good way to address environmental justice concerns?
Objection, Your Honor, that's beyond the scope of direct and the scope of cross.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Thank you. No further questions.
Any follow-up from the board? Vice Chair Richards.
I, excuse me, I'm still getting over a cold, so I have to clear my throat. I think what I'd like to find out is about EJ Screen. It's been referenced several times throughout this hearing. And my understanding, I guess I'll ask you, I'm not sure if you're familiar with EJ Screen.
Yes.
Okay. Is it, we've heard a lot about the usefulness, but it sounds to me like there's some concern that it doesn't necessarily represent the local level. Has it been used in, you're working with EJ communities, has it been used as a resource in sort of delineating different stressors in other communities as a first step?
Yes, it is a first step. And it should be said that all of these screening tools that the agencies, all of the agencies are coming out with EJ screening tools. They are supposed to be used in conjunction with local data and local information, which includes qualitative information. But yes, they're really resourceful, and also the main thing, letting people know that community members are not lying, that these disparities continue to exist no matter what rhetoric or talking points or sort of like trying to parse the words that industry and others try to say. These are data sets that say these community members are not lying about their experience.
I just had one other question, Mr. Hearing Officer. How long has CBPR been around? It seems like it's sort of progressively grown in terms of being able to rely on it. When did that kind of start?
Well, I mean, so
model?
I'm sorry. So it has its roots in citizen science, which unfortunately a lot of scientists use to just say like, hey, community, collect free data for us. But in recent years, I'd say at least within the last decade, around that part, we've seen more revisions where communities were saying, we don't want this to be an extractive experience with us. And there's multiple principles that talk about the lived experience and why it's valuable. Again, the federal government is uplifting it, meaning that they are willing to defend it in court, and that their lived experience needs to be in conjunction with these processes that are going on because they have experience and data that is not being collected.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had.
Any further questions or follow-up from the board? Dr. Henseld, you're done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go ahead and take a 15-minute break at this time. I take it that Dr. O'Donnell is up next.
Yes, Judge, and she's online, so we should be
Okay,
good to go.
great. All right, we'll start her in about 15 minutes. Right, if we can get settled.
Mr. Hearing Officer, just a procedural question, if I might.
Yes, yes, Ms. Rose.
There's been a lot of reference to various parts of the city code, part 41, which is the NSR provision and other sections. And I was wondering whether it's the board's understanding or whether we need to offer those as exhibits, whether the board can take notice of it. Those are all published in the New Mexico Register and in the New Mexico Administrative Code. So my understanding is that we don't need to offer those as exhibits, but I've gotten various direction from boards and commissions. So I was just curious whether we need to do that or whether just citing to those are appropriate.
I think citing to them are appropriate. I think they'll take notice. But thank you, Mr. Rose, for clarifying. Yeah.
It's up on my screen right now. Makes you feel better. It's been up the whole time.
Once again, we'll take public comment at 5:30. So we'll go with your witness as long as we can, Mr. Jantz. Take a break and not sure where we'll be at that time. Once public comment is over, I would expect the board wants to take a half-hour dinner break and then we'll resume most likely at 7 o'clock from 6:30 to 7. Unless you want to do a shorter one, but we'll take it up at that time. Okay. Mr. Jantz or Ms. Locke, I'm going to call you your witness and she's online. Is that correct?
Yes, she should be. Dr. O'Donnell, I see her.
Dr. O'Donnell. Dr. O'Donnell, you're on mute. Can you hear me?
I can.
All right. Do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding? This is the hearing officer.
I do.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Hi, Dr. O'Donnell. If you could you please introduce yourself to the board?
Sure. My name is Kelly O'Donnell. I am an economist. I live in Corrales, New Mexico.
And Dr. O'Donnell, could you talk a little bit about where you are currently employed?
Currently, I'm employed as the Chief Research and Policy Officer for HomeWise, but I also have my own company, O'Donnell Economics and Strategy, that has been providing economic consulting services for the last 14 years.
And could you talk a little bit more about your work history?
Sure. I am an economist by training. I got my PhD at UNM in 2001. I have worked pretty extensively throughout government, both as a government employee, a senior economist with the state, deputy secretary of the Economic Development Department, chair of the Spaceport Authority Board, superintendent of regulation and licensing. After I left government, I started my own consulting company. And as I mentioned before, I have been providing economic consulting services, benefit cost analysis, economic impact analysis, that sort of thing for public and private sector clients throughout New Mexico. I was also employed at UNM for several years as a research professor in the School of Public Administration.
All right, thank you, Dr. O'Donnell. And for the board, her complete written testimony as well as her resume is attached as docket number 180, exhibits 4 and 4A.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that number.
Docket number 180, exhibits 4 and 4A.
4 and 4A. Okay, thank you.
And Dr. O'Donnell, we'll keep this pretty short and just ask you to summarize your testimony as best you can. But first, we'll start with, can you explain your familiarity with sort of the economy of Bernalillo County in general, the growth needs and challenges in the county?
Sure. I've been a resident of the Albuquerque area for about 35 years. My kids went to school and through APS school, so I've been observing obviously the Bernalillo County economy for a long time. I have consulted for both Bernalillo County and the city of Albuquerque on economic development issues, and I have numerous clients who are located in Bernalillo County and for whom I perform economic impact analysis, including the University of New Mexico.
Thank you, Dr. O'Donnell. And what can you tell us about how poor air quality impacts the economy in general?
Well, poor air quality impacts the economy in sort of three broad ways. Number one, it reduces workforce productivity. There's a large body of research that demonstrates that lung diseases are often worsened by air quality issues, and those are established. They have an established impact on workforce productivity. First, people entering the workforce at all. And second, when people are in the workforce, lung diseases and air pollution specifically can impact their workforce productivity, how well they perform at work, absenteeism, how often they show up at work, and showing up at work sick, which has obviously other implications for other employees. So there are a lot of different ways that air pollution affects workforce productivity and participation. So that's the first way. The second way is by precluding other economic development. Frankly, poor air quality is a black mark against a community when businesses are looking to expand or relocate. Businesses aren't going to want to more and more frequently, and it becoming a greater priority for business to locate in places with a high quality of life, good schools, good quality of air, good opportunities for outdoor recreation. As the workforce gets more mobile, it's more and more important that businesses locate in places where people actually want to live. So when you have poor air quality, that really can impact the firms you're able to recruit or support the expansion of. And so it's by prioritizing polluting industry, you foreclose other economic development opportunities when you allow poor air quality to persist. The third way that poor air quality impacts the economy is through its impact on the public sector. Obviously, particularly in New Mexico, healthcare is a huge piece of the public budgets, both for Bernalillo County and for the state of New Mexico. So to the extent that you have an unhealthy populace, and that populace is either being made unhealthy by air pollution or being made more unhealthy by air pollution, that has direct impacts on the cost of doing business and the cost of operating for governments, both in the healthcare space and in the productivity space, because most of the big employers in New Mexico are public sector entities.
Thank you, Dr. O'Donnell. And can you speak to generally what are the primary economic issues and challenges facing Albuquerque and Bernalillo County?
Yeah, I think one of the, I would say, when we're talking about challenges, I'm going to talk about sort of the issues that make it hard to attract businesses to Bernalillo County. And I would, although this is somewhat subjective, in my opinion, the number one issue, and there's a lot of documentation of this, is workforce. Bernalillo County and New Mexico have lower rates of labor force participation than much of the rest of the country. And there are issues with labor force productivity as well. And some of that comes down, again, to our other major issue, which is education. And again, we have some pretty low performing public schools in Bernalillo County, as we do throughout New Mexico. And that is another major disincentive to business. And it also impacts workforce productivity. I think specific to Bernalillo County and Albuquerque now, the third big one is crime. That big quality of life issue.
If you,
Big one is what?
Crime.
Thank you.
Dr. O'Donnell, if you can just slow down for our court reporter just a bit.
Sorry. Can't help it.
Third big one was crime.
Yeah. Yes.
You can continue, Dr. O'Donnell.
That was three.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And Dr. O'Donnell, in your opinion, how does air quality, or does air quality play a role in any of those issues?
Well, I can't say air quality is a big contributor to crime. I don't know. But clearly air quality is going to impact labor force productivity because it contributes to, you know, higher rates of disability and inability to work or inability to work at one's full potential. To the extent that air quality is impacting the health of vulnerable populations like little kids and old people, well, that has an impact on the labor force because those people are often being cared for by people who have jobs or would like to have jobs. So, you know, it's not just the impact on the individual worker, whether their asthma is exacerbated or whatever, it's also the impact on those more vulnerable populations for whom people in the workforce take responsibility. So I think that the workforce issues are to my mind very central, particularly given Bernalillo County's relatively low rates of workforce participation and high rates of disability. You know, again, so yeah, on education, you know, again, it's, do asthmatic kids or kids with breathing problems have more difficulty in school? Sure. I mean, that's anecdotally, that just makes sense. There's some data to support that as well. So while I can't say that improving the quality of air in New Mexico or in Bernalillo County is going to, you know, improve APS's rankings, national rankings, I can say that to the extent that you improve the quality of the air that children are breathing, particularly children who are vulnerable due to other life circumstances, you will reduce the extent to which those health problems compromise their academic performance. So while it's an indirect impact, I think that, you know, when you have schools that are struggling the way ours are, you need to do everything you possibly can to improve and sustain the health of the student body.
Great. Thank you, Dr. O'Donnell. And one further question. In your opinion, would improving air quality in Bernalillo County harm the economy of the county overall?
I don't think so. I mean, I think overall, the impact of a rule that improved the overall air quality would be beneficial to the economy. Could it impact individual businesses negatively? I can't really speak to that, but the overall economic impact, based on the limited research that exists, seems to suggest that whatever negative impacts are felt by individual businesses who have high emissions are offset by the economic stimulus that results from the greater regulatory effort, the greater compliance effort, and those effects appear, at least from the research I've looked at, to offset each other, and the net impact on the economy is fairly neutral, if not positive.
Thank you, Dr. O'Donnell. I have nothing further.
The board have any questions? Board Member Amijo? Member Richards? Chair Paul? Board Member Eberlein? Kelman? Board Member Galuski?
Yes, hi there. One of the criticisms we've heard about the proposed regulation is that it will displace jobs. It's been in more extreme terms described as a job killer. Could you say a little bit about air quality regulations and the extent to which they can harm individual businesses?
You know, I'm going to speak from as a regulator. I hope that's all right, or a former regulator. In my experience, regulations, you know, there are costs to doing business. If regulations are clearly articulated to business and they have those bright lines they need to comply, that's generally the issue. You know, where you see larger costs emerging is where you have a great deal of uncertainty about how a regulation is going to be administered. So the regulation itself isn't the problem. It's the, you know, it's how you go about administering it. And if you administer it in a way that is fairly transparent to businesses and to which in a way that they know that they can comply with it, then the impacts, you know, may be slightly negative. But again, regulation is a cost of doing business in many industries.
Is it fair to say that clarity is an important goal of a regulation?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks.
Chair Paul?
Thanks. I just had one question on you in your written testimony. You mentioned that I believe this is correct, so correct me if I'm wrong, this is from my notes from before we started the hearing, that the current NAC standard still has associations of pulmonary and asthma impacts on children. Do you, in your review of this regulation, does that improve? I mean, you're an economist, so maybe you're the wrong person to ask the question, but I saw that statement somewhere in your testimony.
Can you repeat the question, please?
There was a statement in your testimony about the current NAC standard still having an association. So the standards as they are now are air quality standards in Bernalillo County and Albuquerque, that there's still a level of risk for asthma for children.
The research,
with those
yeah,
standards.
the research I looked at tends to suggest that that is the case, but yeah.
Yeah, and I realized halfway through asking this question that you're an economist and I should be asking this question of someone else perhaps, but just that if, you know, if that was something that actually I'm gonna reserve this for someone else. I apologize for wasting your time.
Thank you. Mr. Pasiniak, do you have any follow-up questions?
No, thank you.
Mr. Domenici.
I want to see if Mr. Mullenberg wants to go first.
Mr. Mullenberg, if you want to proceed first, that's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer. Dr. O'Donnell, my name is Dalva Mullenberg, and I'm an attorney in this proceeding representing the New Mexico Mining Association and the New Mexico Chamber of Commerce.
Hello.
Thank you for your testimony today. Let me start with the issue of certainty to business. I think you indicated a few moments ago that in your view, certainty of regulation is helpful and important to business. Is that right?
Sort of. I think what I meant to say, if I didn't say it, is that clarity is important to business. Certain, you know, clarity in the administration of a regulation. Again, there's the regulation and then there's how a regulation gets administered. And often there's a little space between those two things. So clarity on the part of the regulator in terms of how they communicate with industry about what's required of industry helps to reduce uncertainty. And uncertainty helps it. And once you diminish uncertainty, you diminish the costs that are associated with uncertainty. But I do want to make clear that you don't have certainty in a regulation. It really comes down to how you administer that regulation, how you communicate it.
Thank you. I appreciate that that clarification. Could a rule also have certainty or clarity in terms of making it clear to a business that they could not qualify for an air quality control permit?
I'm sorry, one more time.
Have you considered that another aspect of certainty or clarity with respect to a rule would be a rule that makes it clear that a business could not obtain an air quality permit?
If the rule, I'm sorry, I'm still a little confused because obviously a rule isn't going to be, isn't going to be specific to a business. It's going to be, be articulated to a business by a regulator, but a rule obviously isn't specific to a business. So I'm a little confused by the question.
Okay, fair enough. So I think in your testimony, you indicated that you reviewed at least a version of the proposed rule offered by petitioners that the board is considering. Is that right?
That's right.
Do you recall in that rule some provisions that require the Environmental and Health Division to deny a permit under certain circumstances?
Yes.
Okay. Knowing that I'm referring to a provision of the rule that sets a bright line as to when permit denial is required, does that help you understand my question about a rule that would make it certain to a particular business that they would not qualify for a permit?
If they were not in compliance?
Well,
if they had
or,
exceeded a certain standard, is that what you're saying?
or perhaps it would be clear if you're looking at it in the context of a business that was considering locating or relocating to Bernalillo County. You're nodding your head. I was
following you that far.
I just want to make sure. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure that the court reporter can get a verbal answer if you're meaning to answer my question.
No, I was just nodding along because I had followed you that far. So I was suggesting that you keep talking.
Okay. So you were indicating that you were getting a better understanding of my original question about an aspect of certainty in a regulation that would be to the negative effect or to the effect that a permit for a particular type of business would not be granted or would be denied if an application were submitted.
A particular type of business in a particular type of place based on the pollution that particular type of business was anticipating releasing, correct?
Yes, I think that's a fair way to put it.
And so, and the question, and so then the question is,
did you consider that aspect of the rule, particularly that the rule may make it clear to certain businesses that they could not qualify for a permit even if they applied, and therefore they would not be able to construct a facility and operate within Bernalillo County?
well, as I understand it, the rule is specific to the proposed location of the facility and the emissions, that it would produce, but that is not necessarily in Bernalillo County. It's in a community that would be negatively impacted. So,
yeah, let me move on because I understand you're not an air permitting specialist. So, in terms of the scope of your work, one aspect of your work, and I'm referring to the scope of work section on page 2 of your written direct testimony. One aspect is to analyze the economic impacts of air pollution generally and on Bernalillo County and the city of Albuquerque. What work did you do to analyze the impacts of air pollution on Bernalillo County and the city of Albuquerque?
I basically did, a literature review and looked at the extant research and looked at the conditions specific to Bernalillo County. I did not collect any air quality data or do a specific economic impact or economic analysis of a specific industry or anything like that. I simply looked at the research to date in this area and and
So-
obviously looked at the conditions and the economy of Bernalillo County. But I did not do a specific economic analysis of this specific rule on specific businesses within Bernalillo County.
Fair enough. So you basically reviewed published literature that might be relevant to that question.
Yes, and documents relevant to Bernalillo County's economy and how it struggles and where economic development efforts have been successful or unsuccessful.
Okay. When we're talking about economic impacts and an economic impact analysis, would you and I agree that that generally involves looking at the costs and the benefits of a particular action or condition?
Not necessarily. I mean, economic impact actually has a pretty formal definition. Well, not terribly formal, but there are very specific and accepted methodologies for estimating economic impact. And generally, economic impact is a function of spending within an economy. So, you know, for an economic impact study, the sorts that I do sort of customarily, and it's much more about how much a business is spending in an economy. That's what its economic impact is going to be. A business obviously can have other impacts, but generally speaking, an economic impact analysis is based on what's called input-output analysis, which is a function of, by and large, how much the business spends.
And you've talked about there are specific methodologies for doing that type of an analysis, right?
Yes.
And if I understand your testimony correctly, you didn't actually do that kind of analysis for purposes of your testimony before the board. Is that right?
Not an economic impact analysis. No, that wouldn't have been appropriate. You know, that's generally specific to an institution or a business. An economic impact analysis is. So I wouldn't have done that kind of analysis anyway. I think that, you know, when yeah, I mean, I couldn't have done an economic impact analysis had I wanted to. But again, I think to my mind, the economic impact of a rule is often, you know, determined by how that rule is administered. And so, you know, I think that it would have been, even if it had been a specific business, somebody had said, hey, you know, estimate the impact on this individual business of this rule. I wouldn't have been able to do that at this stage because I don't know how this rule is going, if it passes, right? And if it's implemented, how it's going to be administered. So for me, that's a big question mark in terms of what economic impact it would have on a given business.
So is it fair to say, based on what you've just said, that you really were unable to do an economic impact analysis of?
Objection, asked and answered.
Sustained.
Fair enough. So earlier, I asked a question about your scope of work, looking at the economic impacts of air pollution generally. And then the second task you identify is assessing what economic impacts, if any, will come as a result of a passage of a regulation like the proposed HEEI rule. And I think that perhaps is the question you just answered when we were having this discussion.
I think that one of the confusions here is that I'm using the term, I think the term economic impact is being used very broadly in this setting. And I'm talking about an economic impact analysis of the sort that I perform on a regular basis for specific businesses. So if we're talking broadly, what is the economic impact going to be? My analysis is based on, again, the peer-reviewed research to date and my understanding of the Bernalillo County economy. I did not do any modeling of the economic impacts using modeling software or any kind of economic modeling. Maybe, and I think that's the distinction you're trying to make.
So fair enough. And in your review of the published literature on which you've based your opinions. Is there any published literature that specifically looks at the economic impacts of the HEEI regulation that the board is considering?
This one specifically, no, obviously,
Okay.
that I know of.
Thank you. In your summary of conclusions, you say that air pollution regulation benefits the public interest and has economic benefits because air pollution negatively impacts population health, and a healthy populace is critical to a robust and resilient economy. In that statement, are you saying that all air pollution regulation benefits the public interest and has economic benefits?
Well, obviously, to the extent that air pollution regulation improves the quality of the air, you know, in a measurable way, then that would be beneficial.
And on the flip side, would you acknowledge that air pollution regulation does have costs that can have economic impacts?
There are compliance costs and regulatory costs associated with any regulation. How a business responds to that is, you know, obviously outside of the scope of what I'm doing here, but there are costs, sure.
And in your analysis, would I understand correctly that you did not attempt to assess the costs of the proposed HEEI regulation?
No, I did not look at the compliance costs.
Okay. On page 3 of your written testimony, and I don't know if you have it there in front of you, I'm referring to numbered item 3. And it says a decision to prioritize the economic interests of polluting firms through underregulation could undermine efforts to attract low emission industries and high wage jobs in Bernalillo County. In that statement, regarding underregulation, have you made any conclusion whether the existing regulation of air quality by this board in Bernalillo County is underregulation?
I couldn't speak to whether this is underregulation or not. What I can say is that when there are, you know, public, you know, when the Lung Association gives Bernalillo County a D or an F or whatever, that sort of information is widely dispersed and can be a disincentive and you know, reflects poorly on the county. Now, whether improved regulation would likely reduce the, you know, the ozone and particulate and those things for which we're getting rated very poorly. So to that extent, yeah.
Did you receive any information or find any information in the public literature regarding the degree to which the HEEI proposed rule might reduce?
Objection. These questions are about a rule that doesn't exist yet. There couldn't be any literature about that.
Overruled. You can.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I was interrupted in the middle of my question there, and I believe the hearing officer has indicated for me to continue.
If you can indicate the proposed rule.
The proposed rule, correct. So my question was, did you receive any information or find any information in your literature review regarding the degree to which the proposed HEEI rule might reduce pollution or improve air quality?
Specific to this rule, no.
Yes. Okay. On pages 18 and 19 of your direct testimony, you refer to a study looking at regulation in the South Coast Air Quality Management District of Southern California. Is that familiar to you? Yes.
Yes.
When was that study published?
I have to look for the date. It's fairly recently. And it's in the footnote. So I just need to, oh yeah, 2001.
2001. And my understanding of that study is that it looked particularly at petroleum refineries and a period of new regulation of petroleum refineries somewhere in the time frame preceding 2001.
That's correct.
Okay. We don't have any petroleum refineries in Bernalillo County, do we?
Not as far as I know.
Are there other industries located in Bernalillo County which you would view as, say, heavy industries in the nature of petroleum refining?
I mean, I couldn't really speak to comparable. I mean, certainly there are industries that produce toxic emissions in Bernalillo County. Are they, to what scale? Or are they on the scale of a major petroleum refinery? I couldn't say that. And I don't know for sure.
Okay. Dr. O'Donnell, thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Mr. Domenici or Mr. Rose? Mr. Rose? Okay, thank you. Mr. Domenici?
Hello, Dr. O'Donnell.
Hi.
Hi, my name's Pete Domenici Jr. I represent various clients that are in the construction materials, road construction or construction materials regulated, part of the business group that's regulated by this rule. So, and I note in your in your extensive resume, at one point you were involved in economic development. What was your role at that point?
Well, I've been involved in economic development as a consultant for the last 14 years in various capacities, but in professional capacity, I was the assistant secretary for tax policy at Tax, which was very much involved in developing and administering economic development incentives. From there, I went to the economic development department and was the deputy secretary there. And I was the acting secretary there. I was the board chair of the Spaceport Authority, which is nothing if not an economic development endeavor. So I had a lot of government experience in economic development, but in my consulting, a lot of the work I do is involved with economic development because, well, it involves businesses in the local economy.
And so let's just take a hypothetical new business that wanted to locate to Bernalillo County. They would typically engage in some kind of feasibility or screening to see if the county is suitable for their requirements. Would that be at least one way it would start out?
Sure, yeah.
And if they were going to build a facility, they would have to find a location that's properly zoned for that facility.
Yes.
And then, and do you know one way or another if the rule that you're testifying about today would allow, or actually would overlay all of the zone areas that would be needed for commercial or industrial developers to move to Bernalillo County?
would overlay, so you mean would be implemented in addition to the rules around zoning?
Absolutely. So it would basically
Yes.
say, even though this is zoned industrial and you want to do industrial, this is off limits because we have an air quality rule that says your permit will be denied because of that location.
Right, yeah, that's correct. Zoning industrial would not be sufficient to allow a firm that was emitting pollution necessarily to locate, I mean, above a certain standard. So yeah, this would be in addition to those zoning.
So do you know, for one way or another, if there is any suitable zoning left in Bernalillo County, if this rule is put into place and the overburdened communities are set forth on a map and overlaid, that's why I use that term, and then overlaid on top of a zone map?
Mhm.
Do you know if there's any place that someone trying to locate to Bernalillo County could both satisfy the zoning and satisfy this rule?
Objection, Mr. Hearing Officer. That's beyond the scope of her direct testimony.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
I'll rephrase it. I want to ask you an assumption. I want you to assume that there would be no suitable locations where the zoning allowed the business and this rule also allowed the business for the entire county.
Okay.
What would your view of that economic impact of this rule be if that is the circumstance?
Well, I think if the proposed industry were contributing to, so essentially this is an industry that's emitting toxins to some degree. And you're saying that and this is all speculative, right? You're assuming that all of the industrial zoned areas border overburdened communities, and thus the air quality protections for those overburdened communities would make locating this specific firm in an area zoned industrial impossible. That's your question, right?
That's correct. And it is, I will concede it's hypothetical. It's subject to testimony that's going to occur after you, not just the way these hearings work, but there will be maps introduced that show the rule on top of the zoning.
Mm-hmm.
So if you please proceed.
So so we're talking about a new firm looking to locate, and they aren't looking for a change in zoning. They're simply saying, hey, the area is zoned industrial. I can't locate in them because I emit too much.
Correct.
So yeah, I mean, frankly, to the extent that businesses are prohibited from increasing the pollution load in communities where the pollution load is already very high, I can't, their decision not to locate in Bernalillo County or not to expand in Bernalillo County is a positive or a negative is a good question. I mean, not contributing to an already overburdened community, not contributing more pollution, more public health effects, that's a good thing. Not having a business locate might be a bad thing in the sense that might be jobs that we might not otherwise get. But it's really hard to say in speaking in generalities whether that would necessarily be good or bad for the economy.
Would it be good for Bernalillo County to announce to the national and international business community that this county is off limits for new air quality permits because we put a air quality regulation on top of all of the areas zoned for commercial or industrial activity?
That's a real hypothetical, isn't it? I mean,
Not really.
Well, but it feels that way to me. I mean, and again, to the extent, I mean, so you're announcing to the the world, I think you mentioned, or the international community, or whomever, that you can't cite a polluting, that it's very hard to cite a very polluting operation or facility.
Excuse me, I didn't use the word very polluting. I said a facility that needs an air quality permit.
Because it's polluting. I mean,
Yes, like a hospital. But do you consider UNMH a heavy polluting industry?
I can't even speak to that. I mean, I do work for UNMH, but it has nothing to do with their air quality.
Well, let's just assume the new facility is a hospital that has boilers, and those boilers cannot not satisfy the requirements of this new regulation in a place that's zoned for that hospital. So would that be a detriment to this community if that type of facility cannot locate in Bernalillo County?
You know, if its boilers were so polluting that it was precluded by this particular rule, I mean, it doesn't seem like a very good hospital to me. I mean, so you know, I guess I have the same struggle. I'm having the same struggle. No matter how you frame this, I'm going to come back with the same answer. Obviously, don't have enough details to be able to analyze this, but the reality is that there are economic benefits to clean air and air quality and better public health, and there are economic benefits to job creation, and which one trumps the other is a really good question, and I think it's going to be really case specific.
Well, I think you quoted one of the regulatory requirements for this rule on page 15 of your testimony. It's the top of page 15.
Okay.
And it's after the footnote says should motivate the air board as it considers the economic value of sources and subjects of air contamination in the HEEI rulemaking. Do you understand? Did you pull that phrase directly out of the New Mexico air quality statute as one of the considerations the board must take into account?
No.
Where did you come up with that phrase?
You know, I'd have to go back and look. I mean, I don't think I have a citation here. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I'd have to come back and look at that.
Let me just read you the section of the statute and tell me if it sounds similar to that phrase. That in making rules, the local board shall give the weight it deems appropriate to all facts and circumstances, including, this is subpart 2, the public interest, including the social and economic value of the sources and subjects of the air contaminants.
Yeah.
And you use the phrase economic value of the sources and subjects of air contamination. So is that just a coincidence?
No, it's not. It's not. You're right. You're right. It's not, that is not a coincidence.
So I understand the first part of that sentence, which starts on the prior page, indicates you're talking about the grade. It's a paragraph talking about the F and D grades for ozone and PM2.5 should motivate the board as it considers the economic value of sources and subjects. Do you understand that use of that word source is sort of a key word in air permitting, in that the location where the pollution is emitted is described as the source? And were you using it in that sense in this sentence?
Yes.
And are you aware that, or have you reviewed the pre-filed testimony of Kirtland Air Force Base, the managing contractor for Sandia National Laboratories, the pre-filed testimony for the University of New Mexico, all indicating that this rule will have a negative impact on their facilities that have such sources.
I've read some of the testimony. I didn't read the UNM stuff. But yes, I'm aware that that testimony has been offered. Yes.
In this section, you're talking about the poor air quality should motivate the air board. But there's nothing you're providing about the economic value of the sources in this report, correct?
Yes, that's true.
Let me just go finish on one topic because I think this sort of ties in with what you've testified to and probably your economic development background. So when someone is doing a feasibility analysis, looking to relocate or even looking to expand, I think you indicated that clarity in regulation would be important.
Clarity and administration of regulation. Yes, absolutely.
And does that clarity include predictability of the timeline for the regulatory process?
Yes.
And are you aware that this HEEI rule establishes an entire second hearing process on top of the existing permit process? So it's actually creating two hearing processes, both of which can be appealed, instead of what we currently have is one permitting process and one appeal. Were you aware of that before I just told you?
Yeah, sort of, I mean, yes, but not, I mean, yes, I'm aware that there are existing processes and I'm aware that this is an additional process that would be overlaid on that process. So I guess the answer is yes.
But did you know it would have its own hearing process as part of the additional process?
I don't know.
And do you know if generally when looking at clarity of the administration of the regulations, if the regulated industry would be concerned that the administration or the approval process includes qualitative discretionary provisions that allow a permit to be issued regardless of the quantitative nature of the permit?
That feels like an interpretation to me. The term qualitative is been kind of thrown around and subjective, and those are not synonymous terms. So I can't say I can't agree with that statement.
Okay, let me just be very precise. So I'm looking at the proposed regulation. I don't know if you happen to have a copy of that. I can put one on the screen if you'd like.
I can pull it up.
So this is version 6, which we've been discussing. It's the most current version.
Okay.
And I don't know if you could, sir, would you mind pulling that up? This was 200, docket number 200. And if you have it's there, it's page 20 that I'm looking at. I'm just not sure we have the same version.
Yeah, I'm not either. That's of concern to me.
Okay, so let's go ahead and let this pull up. So
Yeah.
I think you go to page 80 to get to the actual regulation, please. A little more. Okay, now Now, if you'll keep going to page 20 of this document. There, at the bottom of the page, please. So that's the public hearing section for this new regulation. Do you see that, Dr. O'Donnell?
You know, I see it, but I'm on a laptop and I cannot read it. I mean, I can see little bugs,
okay.
so I'm,
Okay, let me, I'm going to read you subpart 2.
Okay.
So this is the public hearing. So the language says the department shall hold a public hearing on the applicant's health, environment, and equity report. And then it indicates that at the public hearing, community testimony, community-based participatory research data, and community air monitoring data shall be given the same weight as technical expertise provided by the department and the applicant. So I don't want to characterize that. I'm just indicating that is something that someone that wanted to locate here would identify as what is going to be part of the hearing process they would have to go through. And my question to you is that, first of all, is that clear to you as to how that would work and whether someone's permit application would satisfy that requirement or not?
oh golly, I'm appearing thank you. That was throwing me off. Looking at myself on the screen. Those statements make sense to me. I mean, I understand what they're saying. You know, and yeah, I mean yes, those statements make sense to me. I understand them.
And so someone running to relocate, say, a $100 million facility to Bernalillo County, or to, say, Lincoln, Nebraska, which doesn't have a provision like this, do you think they would be concerned in weighing their choice, whether they're going to be able to get that permit, that facility permitted, that the outcome of a hearing using that statement, I understand, and I'm clear that I understand you know what it says, but to someone moving into a jurisdiction, based on your experience, wouldn't that cause them some concern about the regulatory feasibility of their project?
You know, when that business, that hypothetical business is going to be looking, obviously, this is not the only regulatory question that's going to be asked, and not the only regulatory hurdle at yours, for instance, zoning, that it's going to face. Does the, you know, I can't speak for, you know, it depends on the business, frankly. And the fact that, I mean, basically what that language says to me is that air quality monitoring data, the official data, is part of the equation, but also part of the equation is the testimony and any data that is collected through a participatory process wherein the community becomes involved in data collection. What that regulation says to me is that what the language says to me is that Bernalillo County values the input of community members and the experience of community members in terms of how a particular facility impacts their quality of life and the air in their community. Could that potentially turn off some folks? Yeah. Could that potentially, could that approach to governance and regulation be attractive to some folks? Perhaps so. And in fact, and obviously the industries that would find a community that prioritized or at least put on level footing the experience of community members vis-a-vis pollution with air quality monitoring data, that might be attractive to some people or to some industries, in some individuals. So, while, yeah, a heavy industry that was likely to be emitting a lot of pollutants and could see that as the fact that the community's experience of pollution and the community's preferences were going to be weighed as heavily as other factors, that could turn off some heavy industry who are likely to be polluters. Yeah. Particularly if there was an equivalent community that didn't have that rule. But I guess the point I've been kind of making or trying to make is that Bernalillo County's big issues, when communities are being compared, some of the major issues pertain very specifically to quality of life and not to necessarily regulatory climate. Not that that's not important, but the quality of life factors are important too. And there are some industries that might value that sort of approach to governance.
So let me change topics. Your report
Mr. Domenici, I just want to point out that direct examination was 10 minutes by my clock. You're at about 45 or 50 minutes. I think it's a little bit disproportionate. So if you can just make certain to just cover what was directed, please.
And this should be 5 minutes or less. So in your testimony, you talk about air pollution in Bernalillo County and air quality in Bernalillo County. And you mentioned PM 2.5 and ozone, correct?
Yes.
Did you just differentiate the source of those pollution items from the community or the sources that are going to be regulated by this rule as compared to truck traffic, vehicle traffic, other sources that are completely unregulated and will not be affected whatsoever by this regulation?
Objection, Judge Sanchez, that's beyond the scope of her direct.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
And if I could, Judge Sanchez, I just want to note that Dr. O'Donnell does have to leave by 6 p.m. tonight. And I know that public comment's supposed to start at 5:30, but I just wanted to flag that for everybody.
I would hope that Mr. Domenici's almost done, and I think we're moving down the line. So
let me just say it the other way. All of your conclusions are regarding air pollution and air quality are based on all of the sources, not just the sources subject to this regulation, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. That's all I have.
thank you. Ms. Navarrete, are there any questions from UNM?
I just have a couple of brief questions. I don't know if you want me to go up to the podium or sit here.
Yeah, you can take it at the podium.
Yes, sir. All right, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So earlier in your testimony, I believe you talked about an unhealthy populace and its direct impacts regarding the cost of business for the government and public and private sectors. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So is healthcare access important for an unhealthy populace as it directly impacts that cost of business?
Is healthcare access important to
For the is healthcare access important for that unhealthy populace as it directly impacts the cost of business?
Yes.
Okay. Is access to healthcare a metric that adds value to the economy?
Of course.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Navarrete. Mr. Harris, I'm not sure if you want to go before Ms. Richards. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. My name is Stan Harris. I represent InTest in this matter. I believe, but I did want to confirm, you've testified that you have not analyzed how the proposed rule will affect any individual business in Albuquerque or Bernalillo County. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Richards?
Good afternoon, Dr. O'Donnell. I only have a couple Bernie economic questions, so I'm hoping you can help me out with those. One thing you stated earlier was that air rules that improve air in a measurable way have economic benefit. Do you recall that?
Yes, a potential economic benefit.
Okay. And when you say improve in a measurable way, do you mean performing an assessment of the improvements that a particular air rule has had on the air quality?
What I'm saying and what I meant by that statement was that to the extent that a regulation improves the quality of air in a measurable way, that will obviously be reflected in statistics that are published about this, Bernalillo County, and be potentially helpful that way. And obviously, to the extent that you are reducing pollution in the air and that pollution is contributing to disease, that obviously reducing the pollution burden that is contributing to disease will help the economy.
So was your answer yes then?
I'm sorry, I forgot your question.
I totally get that. Let me ask you this. Do you have any opinion as to whether this rule will actually improve air quality in a measurable way?
I would expect.
Objection beyond the scope of direct and beyond her expertise. She's an economist.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Let me ask you this then. Isn't it true that you do not have an opinion as to whether this rule will have a positive effect based on an improvement in air quality versus a negative effect based on a decrease in economic opportunities?
Objection, it's the same objection. Mr. Chancellor.
Sustained.
It's a different question. I'm asking for a comparison of what her expertise in the economy is, and she's testified that rules that have measurable effects will improve the economy.
I didn't hear the economic impact, but go ahead and rephrase.
So the question was, isn't it true that you have no opinion as to whether this rule will have a positive effect based on an improvement in air quality versus a negative effect based on a decrease in economic opportunities?
Objection, Judge, she's still asking Dr. O'Donnell to make a decision on whether or not the rule would improve air quality, which is beyond the scope of her expertise.
If you can answer that, Dr. O'Connell, go ahead.
Sure, I'll give it a shot. I think we're sort of apples and oranging it here. I had said that in the case of a specific business that I couldn't speculate as, a specific business that was directly impacted by this rule. I couldn't speak to
Can
whether.
you slow down? I'm sorry, Doctor. Can you slow down just a little bit for the court reporter?
Sure.
Thank you. Just to speak slower.
Okay. I can't, what I said was that I could not speak to the impact on, whether the impact of this rule would be negative or positive on a specific industry or a specific business. Based on my expectation and belief that this rule will translate into measurable decreases in air pollution, I believe that the economic benefit of a reduction in air pollution will exceed the economic cost to individual businesses that might be affected. That's my belief, based on the expectation that this rule will translate into measurable reductions in air pollution.
And on what basis and expertise can you say this rule will result in measurable improvements on air quality?
Objection, beyond the scope of her expertise.
She just made the statement.
I think it's been asked and answered. I'm going to
Your
sustain.
Honor, I'd like a clarification. Several times she has testified she couldn't testify about air quality. Ms. Locke testified it was beyond her scope. She's just stated for the first time that in her opinion, it will have an increase on economic benefit because it will impact air quality. So I'm exploring why she believes that when it's beyond her expertise per her testimony.
I've heard testimony concerning benefits, so it's sustained.
Let me ask you this question. Are there any economic studies that outline how far the average person drives to work from where they live?
Yes.
Generally, how far is that?
Oh, it depends, obviously, on where they live.
Yeah.
And it depends on what community they're in. So, yeah, I mean, I think on average, I mean, look, the last time I looked at this, I looked at Santa Fe, I think it was 14 minutes. But you know what? It's going to be completely contingent on the mode of transportation, where they're located, where they work, that kind of stuff. So,
Right. So then let me ask you this. Are there any studies that outline where people desire to live based on how far they have to commute to work?
there is research, obviously, looking at commute times. You know, I'm not an expert in that research, but you can look at real estate values. I mean, that's going to give you a good sense of you know, where, you know, how the proximity to a job influences the overall, and the length of a commute influences the overall price of real estate. So there, you know, there are studies of that, certainly.
So then let me ask you this. If there's studies of that and you're familiar with those types of studies, if somebody works in Bernalillo, if somebody lives in Bernalillo County and their children go to school in Bernalillo County and all their children's activities and childcare is in Bernalillo County, do they want to live in Santa Fe? Or do they want to drive to work in Santa Fe generally? Just from your study review.
Yeah, I mean, but you know, people's preferences for where they live, I mean, again, I think I need a more specific question. I mean, would I rather live in Santa Fe and work in Bernalillo County? No, but I mean, maybe, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Richards. City of Albuquerque, EHD has now returned. Estela Pueblo, any questions?
I just have one brief question.
Sure, go ahead. You can state your name for the record for the court reporter.
Lindsay Cutler with the Pueblo of Isleta. Dr. O'Donnell, good evening. Since the Pueblo of Isleta is located in Bernalillo County, would air pollution in the county that stifles workforce development and productivity also apply to the Pueblo's enterprises?
It depends on the location of the pollution. So I couldn't, I mean, you know, we're talking about pollution in proximity to certain things. So, I mean, I can't speak generally. The air quality in Bernalillo County would impact everybody in Bernalillo County, but specific pollution would likely have more more concentrated effects in some places than others. So I can't speak specifically to the
air. So you'd say that the air quality in Bernalillo County affects everyone in Bernalillo County, including the Pueblo of Isleta?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So you'd also say that the air. Would you also agree that the air quality, to the extent that that there's air pollution in the county, would that also have a negative economic impact on the Pueblo?
Potentially, yeah.
That's it.
Thank you, Ms. Cutler. I'm not sure if Captain Nafki is now appearing virtually.
Hearing officer, she is on virtually, but she does not have a microphone, I think. So, and I don't believe she has any questions because she texted me.
Is the same for Mr. Willard?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I'm going to assume that Ms. Semino does not have any questions. Brief redirect?
Yep, just.
All right. Hi, Dr. O'Donnell. I just have one question for you. In your opinion, is job creation and the economic benefits of improved public health, are those two things mutually exclusive?
No, absolutely not.
Thanks, Dr. O'Donnell.
Thank you. I believe that takes care of all petitioners and the law clinic's witnesses. We're going to move over to Mr. Domenici's, but we have just half an hour before public comment. I'm not sure if the board wants to take a break.
My understanding is Mr. Rose was going to go first with his case and his witnesses.
Mr. Rose, you've got, are you done?
Should we let Dr. O'Donnell go?
Oh, yes. Sorry, Miss Dr. O'Donnell, you're done.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Unless you want to stay here.
Thanks anyway. Bye-bye. Have fun.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that's a commentary on this proceeding, but.
Yes, okay. That'll be fine.
So are we going to take a break before public comment then? Is that what the game plan is?
That's, let's see what.
I mean, it's up to the court reporter. She's got to.
If you think you can, if you think you can make some headway in 20 minutes, I'm not sure if you have one of your witnesses or both. I think you've got.
And remember, we've reserved opening statements to be before our case. So
that's
great. And I'll try to be brief.
Why don't you do your opening statement then?
Although being brief isn't necessarily something I do well. So
you've got up to 30 minutes. It doesn't mean you have to take all 30 minutes, but
I'm not sure what the benefit is being late. Taking less than that, if there were some incentives, perhaps I might be able to do that. But let me start first. My name is Louis Rose. I'm an attorney with Montgomery and Andrews in Santa Fe. And with me is Carrie Olson, also of Montgomery and Andrews in Santa Fe. And we represent five companies that do business in Bernalillo County: GCC Rio Grande, HF Sinclair, Western Refining, Muscat, and Albuquerque Terminals. And all of those companies have existing facilities within Bernalillo County. And it's my understanding that they all have pre-construction or NSR permits with the Albuquerque Environmental Health Department, and that GCC Sinclair is a Title V facility that has a Title V permit currently within the county. What I think we've heard a lot of testimony, whatever day this is, I guess it's Wednesday now, concerning these proposed rules. And I want to bring us back to the statute and the obligation this board has as the legislature has outlined it in the Air Quality Control Act. And I think there's no dispute that this proceeding is governed by the Air Quality Control Act. You also are a creature of the ordinances that created you, but those were adopted under that act. And the regulatory authority you're being asked to exercise is the authority under that statute. And the way that it's been referenced and the way that petitioners have outlined it, they're calling upon your authority to adopt regulations to prevent or abate air pollution. And air pollution is a defined term within the statute. It basically means there are two things. One, dealing with health, not just of people, but animals and plant life. And it talks about may with reasonable probability injure. And regardless of how lines should be drawn, you think perhaps of the best science, the legislature has identified that you're required to look at reasonable probabilities of injury. It also tasks you with looking at unreasonably interfering with public welfare. And it outlines a couple things that constitute public welfare. The legislature has also directed you as to the kinds of information you should consider. It mandates that you consider all relevant evidence, but then goes on to outline some specific issues, cost being one of them. And you've heard testimony, and you will hear testimony throughout this proceeding concerning a number of those different criteria. The statute also spells out, and I think your counsel alluded to it at the beginning, although that was quite a while ago, concerning it authorizes you to adopt regulations more stringent than federal regulations in certain areas. But it tasks you after notice and hearing to determine those regulations are more protective than the federal regulations. And I'm not sure I know what that means, and there's certainly hasn't been tested, and there's no court guidance as to what more protective might mean. So that's something that you're all may ultimately be tasked to address here as well. Just a brief comment on this proceeding and how we got to where we got. You're in a fairly unique situation, and I think throughout this you've identified that this is the first time, or one of the first times, that you're hearing a proposed rule that's being proposed by someone other than the Albuquerque Environmental Health Department. And I think what we've seen and that petitioners have struggled with is crafting a rule to address situations is a much more difficult task than opining on somebody else's proposed rule. And I think that's why you've seen various iterations of the rule. It gets refined to address comments, but as I think you'll find out, no rule is perfect, and that even if you adopt this or something similar, you'll probably be called upon to address the rule as it becomes applied. And just an allusion to that too is that part of the examination I did of Dr. Clark yesterday was to try to bring out to the board how this regulation might be administered. And we're doing this in the absence of the entity that's actually going to be charged with administering this regulation. So we're left to speculate, and I guess we'll see whether our predictions are correct or not correct. But that's something that I think would be helpful if they were here to give us guidance as to what they think the reg means and how they intend to administer it. And you'll see that in our testimony. And you have before you written, direct, and rebuttal testimony of two witnesses on our behalf, Michael Salente and Scott Cohen of Trinity Consultants. Mr. Salente, in his direct and rebuttal testimonies, outlined his experience. He, on behalf of Trinity, represents a number of businesses in the county, in fact, throughout the state, prepares air quality applications, and then represents those entities in proceedings before the regulatory agency in terms of the state. It's the Environment Department, and for Bernalillo County, it's the Albuquerque Environmental Health Department. And he's outlined his experience. He's outlined what these regulations might mean and how they might be administered, and what that means to an applicant who's required to prepare an application. And you've got his testimony on what he believes the reg requires. You've got his estimates on what it will cost or what they will charge to companies that intend to do business here or propose air quality permit applications for new construction or for modifications of existing facilities. You heard Dr. Clark yesterday opining, giving his opinion on whether those figures are inflated or realistic. Mr. Salente is here to respond to questions concerning that, but his estimates, as you see in his testimony, are based on his understanding of this proposed rule. You also heard testimony throughout this proceeding, and particularly from Dr. Clark, about how various air quality control districts in California have addressed toxic pollutant problems, however you want to define it. Mr. Cohen is a employee of Trinity in California who has experience representing clients in proceedings in California in various toxic pollutant situations involving a number of air quality management districts. And his testimony responds in part to Dr. Clark's. As you might expect, we see the world and he sees the world in terms of how the California experience has transpired and how it's been represented to you somewhat differently than Dr. Clark. We believe that after you review this testimony and the testimony of other participants in this hearing, that you will conclude that in fact this regulation is burdensome and does not necessarily address the problem identified by petitioners. And we would urge you, based on that evidence, not to adopt the regulation as proposed, including the various iterations of the regulation you have before you. So that concludes my opening statement, Mr. Hearing Officer. We have, as I said, we have two witnesses. Mr. Salente is our first witness, and Ms. Olson is going to question him. We can, I think, get his summary of his direct in before 5:30 if that's the pleasure of the board at this point.
Sure. Let's go ahead and make some headway, Mr. Mullenberg.